So we are I'm delighted to welcome our speakers tonight. Stephanie Edwards, who's the co-director of Urban Symbiotics, who's going to speak about community engagement and co-design, which is one of her specialist areas, a very accomplished architect and urban designer. And Victoria Thornton, OBE, who is the founder of the Thornton Education Trust, a new charity dedicated to empowering the future generation, is going to say a few words before we kick off. And I am mindful of the fact that we've been doing our current programme of talks every month since June 2020 when I took it on. And we were in lockdown, and we went on live streaming every month for 2 whole years, and then opened here. And then all the talks are all available. They're all videotaped, so you can go online or on our YouTube page and you can check them out. But I wanted in the programme to make sure that we upheld and focused on one of our major commitments as an educational charity and trust, which is to promote and support diversity and equality of opportunity in the built environment professions, because we've still got a long way to go. And so in the programme you can see online all the rich variety of people that we focused on. And I also wanted to flag up community engagement with the objective of social value, because I thought that it had often been neglected in architectural talks programmes. So we had Sumita Singha, who's the founder of Autotelic Architecture. We had Christina Norton, co-founder of Soundings. And then we had Stephanie. So Stephanie last year won the award that was the Youth Engagement Award that was made by the Trust as part of their Inspire Future Generations programme. And so that brings me full circle. We've got the next awards coming up in November. And so that means that Victoria can shed some light on that particular award in the context of the Trust's activities. So without further ado, over to Victoria, then Stephanie, who'll speak for half an hour. We've got a quarter of an hour for Q&A, and then we'll adjourn for drinks. Out of this door, immediately turn left and go up the stairs. So get your questions ready, and we look forward to hearing what they both got to say.
Yes, you're doing all the work this evening after Stephanie. So I just wanted to, Stephanie, I've actually only known for a little while, and because she was actually one of the judges for our Inspire Future Generation Awards. But actually, it was just fantastic having that conversation about realising very much on the same page, but actually doing the work, as it were, rather than just talking about this whole thing about engagement, and particularly about young people. She'll talk about co-design as well, I'm sure, but I think the key thing is everybody talks about it, but they don't really engage in it. And yet, as I always say, it's not a nice to have, it is a must have. And they are the future generation, whoever going to be in wherever it is. So I've just been to Cambridge to look at Eddington. Really nice development, just by the university, they own it. But because they were using it for their key workers and their PhD students, they didn't have to do any engagement. But actually that would have been a great opportunity to see and actually talk to their students what it would mean to them to actually engage in what they wanted for their community, because it's a sort of like a little village there, so it's a community. So I think there's other room here who I know here. Angela has always been pushing this from Brady, and Venetia, who has been pushing for urban learners. So there has been a number of people, individuals or small organisations doing it, but it isn't going through mainstream. And I think this is why we've talked about is actually saying it needs to go mainstream. It needs to be part of the Social Value Act or whatever. But we need to understand how it works, all the different approaches. because it's not just one approach, as we know. So I'm really delighted to know a bit about Stephanie's, but actually hear more about it today. Alongside that, she's obviously been doing other developments, master planning. You've been working with different councils as well, which was an interesting thing. And I suppose you studied the AA, and I've just been president of the AA, not in her time. So we sort of have some commonalities in our short time together. So I'll say nothing more at the moment. Obviously, when Stephanie's saying, if there's something you really want to ask her, she's talking. I'm sure you don't mind to kind of stop and start. But get your questions in place so we can really have maybe a good discussion about this as well. So thanks, Stephanie, for coming and presenting to us. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Lucy, for inviting, and thanks, Victoria. But really great to meet you all in the room, actually. I don't think I know most of you, so it's quite a nice almost introduction. So my name is Stephanie Edmonds. I'm an architect and urban designer, and I'm one of the co-founders of Urban Symbiotics. And so Urban Symbiotics is a architecture, urbanism and design consultancy that's really focused on the user. That is our real USP, and that's what we will always continue to try and do. So today I really want to talk to you about how we innovate or find different solutions to really create that impact using engagement and co-creation and different ways of participation. We hear participation all the time, we hear co-creation all the time. Sometimes it's done well, sometimes it isn't. But for us, it really is about being really playful, being really curious, being really exploratory. But most of all, being open. We're very clear that whenever we go into a project, we're really open about not defining what that outcome is until we really try and dig deep as to, what are the issues, what are the constraints, what are the aspirations. And so with that, we might talk about co-creation, but sometimes it's about co-solving or understanding that participation methods are as unique as the people that we're really trying to get to. We use insight elements, we process them to get to real trend analysis. So people might see us just writing post-its, but really we're focusing on how can we turn that into data sets? How can we ensure that really leads to something that's very clear and very directive in terms of brief formulation or how we can actually develop our designs. And I just wanted to just add one thing here is just a lot of the times it feels as if co-creation and participation is resource heavy, which it is, but also just the beauty of conversations. We try and throw out the defined questions and really understand that, if you can have a true conversation and really listen deeply, you can actually unveil the unique. You can, we find ways of immersing, observation, all of these aspects really help us to understand how we can innovate, how we can create bespoke and tailored solutions. And we really have seen that it reaps endless opportunities and value across all of our projects. So why do we do that? So I'm sure probably a lot of you in the room are advocates of co-creation participation, but we've really seen that it enhances the design process itself. It's about building that trust as well as defining and shaping that outcome. It's a real tool for innovative design solutions we'd never assume that we should have at the end, or how we even need to communicate that a lot of the time. Or just a gateway to enhance that user experience of homes, of places, neighbourhoods and cities. And then outside of the spatial, for us it's also a real platform for wider social cohesion and mobility. We had a great workshop on Saturday, and the different community members were we just love this. We love knowing other people. We love knowing about how we can have a voice to shape the space. And there's so many peripheral benefits, including combating loneliness, contributing to wellness. And also, whilst it is resource heavy, when we find that we develop that engagement at the beginning, it becomes more efficient. People are brought in, you have less resistance, and you understand the challenges before it just comes in, as a surprise at the end. And so for us, just a bit more about us as Urban Symbiotics. We have some of our team members in the room today, but how we formed it was from myself as an architect and urban designer and James Stewart, product designer. And so we try and use that product design perspective to really look at shaping how we work in the built environment from a product design perspective. It's really understanding, putting the user at the focus, having that kind of approach in terms of being evidence-based, having focus groups that are demographically representative, and understanding it's not just about the place, such as a product, when we all had the iPhones at the beginning, it's about the packaging, it's about the identity. It's so much more than just the final design solution. We try to do that in our spaces too. So how do we do it? So I've put a standard approach. Obviously not everyone does this, but in terms of consultation, we tend to have engagement just before planning. You might have post-occupancy evaluation at the end. And then a lot of the focus tends to be about the design. What are you designing? With a small amount of engagement and even smaller amount of insight to inform that. But then our approach, we really are passionate about having that continuous engagement right at the beginning that continues throughout that process. And that unique engagement for us is just as important as the design, but even more importantly is that insight. So we're developing upon the insight of an area, of people, of what we assume may be the existing, the new population of an area, but that insight is so extremely important to us. And how we do it, so we're working with the Quality of Life Foundation, so we have developed a inclusive toolkit, so I definitely suggest that you download it. It's quite an interesting way of looking at the 7 different stages, but for us, just a bit simpler, we also look at 4. The first one is about identifying and understanding, really understanding a community, understanding an area, understanding, what engagement has happened before. Do people feel like there is fatigue? But what data do you have, like footfall data, aspects like that? And then we use that information about that demographic to help co-create or participate, but really understand what is the best way of reaching all of these different stakeholders and community members and demographics. And then we move on to realising, which is a lot of the time when we do regeneration frameworks, it's identifying projects. Sometimes we can test projects as part of the process. Does it actually work? And then owning and using. And by this time, it's hopefully a really good time where people feel more ownership, they can start to program the space, and there's that sense of adaptation and care. So in practice, how does this actually look? I'm just going to deep dive into 3 projects and then a few quick fire at the end. I'll talk to Swaffham first. This is the project that we won the Thornton Education Trust Award for. It was part of a High Street Heritage Action Zone. And so this project, the High Street Heritage Action Zones are historic England plans that really focus on areas that are usually quite deprived, but also have a lot of, are quite asset-rich, historically asset-rich. The place itself was completely traffic dominated. I mean, at the sense of you'd stand there and have HGVs almost as big as the buildings, literally, like it was quite oppressive and shocking. Dilapidated buildings, real traffic domination. I always think, imagine if you're sitting there having your lunch and you're right next to this 4x4. But then they also had really interesting like auctions every Saturday where they'd have somebody that walks around the town, close off the entire space to to cars and just starts to look at selling things. It's a really historic, playful celebration in an area, and it's really quite nice to see. It does have some good historic assets, some really interesting activity. But for us, they really wanted us, the Brecon Council and Historic England, wanted to look at how we could transform and revitalise this space. So we used our process. So step 1, we tried to understand what is Swaffham. So we looked at, the gender split. We looked at the population, the ethnic split. We looked at the population also in terms of age range. So here just shows you that actually the higher ranges were mostly elderly. It's a market town in Norfolk, and it had an elderly population. But our insight also from the client started to really expose to us that whilst even though, there's lower populations of young people, they were just not engaged in the process. So whilst they're less, they also needed to have a very specific focus as working with young people as well as catch-all type engagement. So for us, we were very clear about how to reach out. We decided that we needed to work with the Iceni youth to go to the youth population. We worked with the Brownies because young girls really felt quite closed out of a lot of the spaces. They felt unsafe, they didn't feel like they had a sense of ownership of the area. We also want to look at new occupants. Swaffham's growing, so we really tried to focus on who are the people moving in the area as well as those that exist. We went to the Christmas market, to Margaret's Tea Room. We have a whole list of how we were very targeted to our reach. And then we managed to get over 2,000 insights. We spoke to over 567 young people, and that's excluding 1,000 responses from a questionnaire from their school. And then also that process of value, like they had 70 hours of access to professionals as young people too. But with our engagement, we tried to make it as appealing as possible. We came to the Christmas fair and we had a Christmas tree. So it's not, if you're not interested in shaping your area, we tried to look at how can you incentivise people to be involved in the same way. So we had focus groups just with young girls. We also had a big stall where we really got to engage. I mean, by the end, you couldn't see a Christmas tree at the end, but it was a nice way of engaging and getting people involved in shaping what they'd like to see. In terms of our insight analysis, we were very clear about how we started to look at the priorities of people. And then so this is all of the analysis, sorry, it's a bit small, but it led to the vision objectives about Swaffham. People wanted to celebrate its heritage, young people, older people, visitors. They wanted to be able to move around easily. They wanted to put Swaffham on the map. They wanted to create more event and performance spaces and also have more green spaces and connections. And with Swaffham's history with auctions and performance, we then worked together to set the stage for a 21st century. So it was about setting the stage. It was about enhancing the views and experience of Swaffham. It was about creating a sense of arrival, so almost using theatrical processes to engage people as to how we move forward. Promoting the show, working with Norfolk County Council and Swaffham to get people involved in coming to Swaffham, and reclaiming the space. So instead of saying, we don't want you to park here, we're like, how would you like to use your space? And then we were able to ease into the conversation about, well, maybe you do not park here because we are providing performance space and event space. It's less challenging, but also very clear about people's need for a car, but also a need for something else. And then introducing new performance and acts, and that's where we brought young people in about reclaiming some space for themselves too, and creating a consistent backdrop and arranging the scenery, better greened areas, enhanced areas for water, and essentially using that, setting the stage for Swaffham. So this is our work where we started then developing co-designing spaces directly with the school. So we went into assemblies, we spoke to them about where would you like your selfie spot, trying to understand, from a young person's perspective, they don't use selfies anymore, by the way. This is an old person's view, we found out, about how young people actually see their spaces, but what's important to them. So we worked, this was the Urban Symbiotics team, we got in there and we really started to work with, how would they like to use these spaces? How can we develop a hub with you? Where would you like to go? What are the challenges at the moment? And then we also worked with a local poet, because heritage isn't always as accessible to young people. And it wasn't always that people didn't always want to draw, and we found another way to get young people involved in placing that importance of heritage, but also shaping the future. This is a really beautiful poem that they wrote together with this poet, and just at the end, they speak about, there's always been a duck pond, she says, in a voice that sounds like a handshake. And the rainbows and the guides have always trotted like ducklings with donations for the food bank on a Friday. And that's just one quote, but at the end it talks about another Swaffham arrives, young and energetic, leaping from one fence to the next. And the young to the old, Swaffham sit together on the edge of history, holding their breath. And they managed to perform this, and they're now going to perform that in their space. But it was just a different way of seeing young people really invest and understand how they would like to change their space. It isn't, I spoke about spaces almost being like products. It's about the emotional, that emotional feeling you feel to a place, as well as that sense of ownership, as well as how you can visually change it. So again, we developed with them, how are they going to perform? How can we look at these pop-up spaces that are already starting with auctions? So we started to look at the shambles. At the moment it's a car park, because most places seem like that at the moment, and worked with the young people, start to draw, what would they like to see? What would they like to do? And this was a really easy way of looking at how you could have like furniture as a stage, or bring together some flexible furniture and create like centrally strung, intimate lighting to create something that was the shambles, that was the start of the market historically, but actually not just harking back to the past, but looking at what is now the heart of Swaffham and developing that with young people, from like new paving, like very small changes, but with a high impact. And then similarly, working with a co-design of a car park and mobility hub, specifically for young people, where they would hang out waiting for a bus, but they were always seen as a nuisance, never seen as, you know, people that should be there. You know, they were always told to move on. So actually it's creating a space with them that they could be a place of movement, a place of additional planting, seating, performance, and a bit of a hub where you can go from a car to a bike to a bus, and really trying to work with developing and using their insights to shape our design. But then just looking at this kind of enhanced public realm allocation. So we also, how we engage, we like to call it capacity exchange. We tell you a bit, you tell us a bit. And we're trying to look at, for example, this blue area showing all of the space that was given over to motor vehicles. And then the fragmented space that was given over to pedestrians. And then also showing how the Swaffham worked on an auction day. But then also talking to people, would you be happy with a balance, like a balanced proposition? It's not completely like a Saturday, but you can have spaces that are protected for your younger people, for those who have mobility issues and for performance, and you can still park. So also responding back, you know, hearing from what people's insights and priorities are and working together to shape that. Ooh, and then again, also looking at how we can look at different shapes, closing off. They wanted a big dining event, how you can just have linear spaces that you can close off. And it's a real way of starting to expand and contract different spaces, responding to that need of celebrating heritage, having this, you know, kind of theatrical expression. And then finally, the master plan was really a sense of creating active zones, slow zones, resilient zones, that then work together for the final master plan enhancement scheme. And then the final was, we had a really good reception, and Breckland Council and Historic England were just so happy to see how this High Street Heritage Action Zone had been informed by the community. They spoke about it having this exciting and innovative array of projects. We created, you know, stages for the outdoor, a community-tested approach, a youth-focused transport hub that's well-being focused. It's almost a catch-all, but very specific to the people of Swaffham. But also, whilst we want our process to be very accessible, we're very clear that we want our outputs to be accessible. And we set up, whilst we have a master plan strategies book that's very much focused for planners, we also looked at an activities book. So if you're a young community group, there's almost a bit of a handbook to say, this is what you need to do to hold an event in this area. And these are the things you need to know, or what you might need to get funding for or approve, or the spaces handbook, the physical change of just each space. Knowing that sometimes master plans just get shelved, but how you can still enable that accessibility, or young people can see their voice in something they continue to shape and change. And of course we won a TET award, which was really quite great. But this is the first time I've ever been to committee where the chair has been, I'm so happy to see, you know, they welcomed us into the room. It's the most bizarre thing. But it's because we'd reached out to every single councillor, and every single person in that room could say, I shaped this. This is part of me, and this is part of my constituents. But it was a very prideful moment, but it just felt so good to have so many people on board and, you know, testing. They heard, they fed back, we relayed. And then these are just some of the quotes from them. So quickly moving on to Purley, using the same approach, and this is in Croydon. And so this was, we were appointed by Croydon Council to develop a regeneration framework. And that current status, it was very much, the community was a dissenting community. They were against all of the development and that was happening in the area. But these grey areas start to show all of the development sites in that very small area, but there was no consistent approach. There was no way that the community could see how they were benefiting from all of this development. So you could understand why the community were upset. They saw, development to be inappropriate. It was very traffic congested. They had massive flooding issues and derelict sites, but a lot of building. And so there was a real contentious kind of current status when we started. So we again looked at the demographic. It was right at the beginning of 2020 in March. So we were like, how do we engage? It was quite new to us. So in that sense, we curated the Pearly Panel. The Pearly Panel is a demographic representation of Pearlies. So it literally met the charts of the demographics of the area. We then use them as a single point of engagement in the first instance, who then use their contacts to reach out to the youth project, to the mosque, to the churches, to the food bank users, to the residents association, such a wide group of people. And we worked with them to be community ambassadors, who are actually now still working today. So these are some of our engagement events online. We also developed a survey with them, which, because we asked the community to share the survey, I think within an hour we had over 200 responses, which we'd never seen, but it was that community to community engagement that helped us. And then this is one of the, just a picture of the Pearly Panel, one of our first meetings once lockdown has subsided. But now we worked in a really interactive way, so we had ways for people to engage on like engagement boards outside. We had like a fun, they called it the Super Saturday. They had, they had food, they had events for young people, they had magicians. We also had pizza events for young people. We went to assemblies. The Pearly Panel went out to each of their people. We had business focus groups, and it just allowed us to get as many people involved as possible. And then we had an interactive map where we were able to record people's thoughts of the area that got translated into a placemaking framework, but also not just the physical space, but also moving on to the cultural strategy, which is just as important as how do you develop culture and activity within the spatial remits that you're also designing for. And then finally, this was part of the project and vision of creating a Pearly that's a unique, active and evolving destination. But it also started to focus on their parks. They wanted them to operate more as community centred. How could we facilitate their high streets as a hub for multi-generational use, for people to use that in a way that is protected from a lot of the traffic, but also a place for activity. A station as a catalyst, knowing there was vacant spaces to develop in that area. And then also the thoroughfare as a showcase, knowing that image was just as important to them as function. They wanted people to feel prideful to live in Pearly as a nice place for people to stop. And then again, we did another accessible handbook for the community projects, which they're now using, and also a more detailed and technical document, which is now informing the local plan, and a website. And this is some of the pages just from the, we're very focused on what are the projects, what are the priorities, how do you implement these, not just a urban design strategy that would then need further work to deliver. Well, didn't need to deliver. Then Croydon became bankrupt, so after all of that great work, it was, we managed to get our last invoice in at the last stage, but we were like, what do we now do with this framework? But whether it made business sense or not, we decided to stay on with the Pearly Panel because we developed such a relationship with them that it was very hard to just leave them and say, Croydon are bankrupt, we are now stepping away. So we worked with them to actually get GLA funding. So now are an exemplar high street for Croydon, and we're now working with them to actually develop some of their projects. So this is an alleyway that is quite awful, and it's not very nice to even walk through in the day. And this is an empty Sainsbury's site that's been closed for over 20 years. And we now have funding to start to work with the Pearly Panel to develop that. So this year we are now working with an artist, Hannah Bennyhood, she's now worked directly with the young people, the women of Pearly, to develop a pathway that is co-designed by women and has additional lighting. We're looking at designing a placemaking toolkit for activities to occur, and also events happening with the Pearly Festival this year to coincide with the Croydon Borough of Culture, also screenings. So it's really nice to see it going from a dissenting community to a framework, and now to realised projects. We're really in that kind of testing and realising phase. there's a lot of impacts which I'll go through, but I'll just quickly go on to the last one. But I guess this page is just about, it's never just the community that benefits, it's also the place, but also the client. I mean, with Croydon being bankrupt, they've still managed to improve the area, so it just shows how efficient a process can be if you get people to buy into a project that they feel involved and to carry on and feel proud of. So finally, Dagenham Heathway, we're working with Be First to develop a high street regeneration strategy and community vision. We've now just been awarded levelling up funding for this project, which is great. So you can now see that there will be a pipeline for projects to actually be developed. Again, looking at the demographics of the area, very diverse. It has a lot of deprivation in the area. But we also managed to get TfL footfall data, which is really interesting, and it started to talk about Tuesdays being the most popular days, and the fact that they had a really good bounce back over COVID of people. It wasn't necessarily a dying high street, but we also started to realise that there's a lot of people that are digitally poor, so it doesn't calculate those who don't have a smartphone or aren't using cards. So then there is a gap. So understanding this is some baseline information, but not just relying on it. Again, we had a lot of conversation, a lot of post-its using our process of defining what are the priorities of the area. Retail and food came up a lot in terms of diversity, crime and safety, perception and appearance, but nighttime did not come up. And that was a really interesting thing, because we were like, oh, okay, then it must be fine. No, it just was not in their mind map to think of the night, because it's just not a place you go to in the night. So I think that was almost the beauty of the conversations, this idea of delving a bit deeper. And then understanding these underutilised assets. It wasn't a dying high street, but there were vacant shops, vacant spaces, vacant areas that could be, was adding to that lack of, good perception of an area and functionality. And so we set up My Heathway Shop. We used one of these vacant spaces to have a space that we could talk directly to the community to. We could open up, we were there for 8 months. We had a lot of insights, a lot of conversations where people tell us, come back the next week and say, I don't believe you. We had really honest conversations. And in this space, we had an artist just feedback visually, so that those who had literacy issues and those who had, language, who couldn't speak English very well, could understand what we were hearing and feeding back. We had workshop spaces, ideas walls, places that people could really interact in different ways. And then we developed, working in the same way of vision statement, that Heathway, the community, different communities and people of Heathway wanted a place that they're proud of, a place that they could call their own. But they really wanted to support those in need. There's a lot of deprivation, a lot of homelessness, a lot of vulnerabilities, but it wasn't we want this removed, we want to find a way to support this, and it should be visually supported. And also a place that celebrated culture, and it was very bespoke to what people need, a place that's convenient, almost operated as a physical Amazon. It has, they had, a pound shop and a Wilko's, and it really served the community well. So it's like how to preserve what you have well, and also had to add those, celebration of culture, celebration of community, supportedness. So our inclusive and varied approach, we went directed to Future Youth Zone to speak to young people. We allowed community group to use our spaces. We worked with accessibility groups. We set up along Dagenham Heathway Station. We had these conversations in the shop and built this relationship and development. We also started to, I'll say identify, not really identify, but understand that there were a lot of people working under the radar in Dagenham that were almost pieces of social infrastructure. This lady runs a charity shop, but actually she's a mentor for people trying to get work. This guy works in a tech shop, but he's also a mentor for young people coming into his shop. And then you had the leader of the boxing club, who also was an ex-police officer who worked really well with the young people and schools. And so you had these, simple places that had such wide impacts. And it's like, how can we incorporate that as part of our vision, almost beyond the spatial? So we had these 4 phases that we developed, developing a foundation to change. Whilst people really wanted codesign artworks and improvement of spaces, without community support, a place that's clean and a place that's safe and secure, they did not want to see anything else, because it shows they're not listening, their priorities aren't being met, and we're able to work with the council to now develop this, as then establishing a community ethos, moving from testing to success, seeing if it works or not necessarily putting a permanent change. And then finally, some long-lasting retail diversity, shopfront improvements, more accessible Heathway, which we now have a lot of funding for each of these projects. So again, continued property use. This is one of the pilot projects that's now going to continue as part of the My Heathway and Our Heathway project. Ambassador and steward support. The questions people started to ask us started to show a need of the area. And then a co-created programme and use, like developing a twilight zone so people can get used to coming into the night. So and also developing like meanwhile parks. This is a park that outside of the area, but it shows the temporariness that you can add. And then having that identity of people being reflected in the area that they live. And so again, bring it back to how these assets can start to develop as part of that. And then just some others where we've used this before. We've also used the exact same process to develop a meanwhile park working with a representative forum called the Gascoigne Residents Forum. We've worked with them to develop Phoenix Park, which has now it's a finalist for one of the Urban Design Awards. But it's great because it's now being used for iftars, for harvests, for Easter egg hunts, and also for some urban gardening. Also, we set up a residents advisory board for the whole of the borough of Barking and Dagenham so that we could start to shape how Be First developed their 10,000 homes. So actually started to look at how flexible can you be with your home? How can you ensure that if you're just a two-person couple that as a designer, we haven't stopped you from socialising, from working, from hosting, from really expressing yourself and your identity. And this is going to be published soon as it's an ideal home charter for Barking and Dagenham to guide the homes moving forward for the people of Barking and Dagenham. It's really interesting in talking to someone who's in a wheelchair who said, this is great, I have a wet room, but I have a 6-year-old daughter who needs a bath. It's these conversations that really need to almost influence policy and change in design. Co-design design code. We're working with the Becontree estate at the moment to look at a residence charter, to look at a design code for the future of this area, but also the retrofit of a home. So this is one of the models working with Archeo to develop how you can retrofit your home, or just be empowered if you're a renter to say, I know how much this costs, I know this will increase my comfort, I can afford to pay you more. So it's about also skill sharing, but looking at the future development with a group, but the wider area. And then finally, just one last one of Almaty vision making. This was in Central Asia. We worked together with a city master plan in the same fashion, bringing people into rooms to understand where they saw a city as the down, the up, what that means, how we can expand that kind of mind map of bringing together two halves of a city. And then finally, our work doing urban renewal in Nigeria for UN Habitat, working with informal retailers, working with informal communities, but using that same approach of engaging very bespoke to a community or different people, their needs and their barriers. And I will stop there, and yeah, thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to
That was marvellous. That was really inspiring, Stephanie, just like last time, but for the pleasure of everybody in the room this time. So I just, I think such a wealth of thoughtful, interconnected processes. You're turning the whole, narrow top-down kind of master planning approach upside down, aren't you? Drawing out the value that only the local community with all their knowledge and their skills can support, and then connecting them each to each other and then also to the local place assets. It's just really, it's so badly needed as well. So let's move on to some audience questions so we can allow enough time for our drinks afterwards. So who has a question for either Stephanie or Victoria? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, have you, from your projects that you've completed or in the frameworks, have you had a chance to kind of go back and review how they've worked afterwards and gain any insights from that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so for example, the Pocket Park has been really interesting because the Gascoigne Forum programmed it quite well. You know, this is where you'll have a birthday party and this is where you'll have, games. But on the same day of the event, someone came back and was like, can I grow my vegetables here because I really need a space? And so, it's now been extended to accommodate some of these areas. Or, they had really fantastic iftars last year and we had enough space, but it was almost like, oh, okay, like flexibility really needs to be incorporated and how you can enable that to work better this year. But what's really nice, I think that's almost that kind of testing and piloting that we really enjoy, or even the shop. So we're now putting the shop as like a kind of My Heathway hub as part of our projects, but we've been there for 8 months. We kind of see like who comes in, who doesn't come in, what are the things that tend to invite people into a space and not. And so I'd like to keep doing that and continue to do that because it is so important. Again, it's that kind of post-occupancy evaluation, not just of homes and buildings, but of spaces, and how that then can inform some of the work we continue to do, but also as an industry, if we can share that too.
This is also a little bit like this idea of how you keep track of the work, and I don't know if you ever have to work with future-proofing, like the growth or the development of the area, and obviously a lot of the analysis that you get from the day of, or like those weeks or those months of getting that data in, doesn't really tell you yet who is gonna move in or how is that gonna grow, and real estate developers usually don't really know or tell you how they're going to market the growth of specific areas. How do you, in such a thorough methodology of understanding the today, how do you also allow for that growth and that understanding of this community will work more merged with other communities, or how do you foresee that working, and if you've ever done it this way?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Quite a few people have said, well, how do you do that, with populations that aren't there? Like, how do you ensure that they're able to feel part of a change? And I think we think about that a lot of Purley because there's a lot of development. So there's so many new people coming in, and what's been great about staying on with the Purley panel is like, how do you ensure that that panel is still accessible and open? And I guess what we've realised is that it does need, it needs refreshing. And so it's about, we're looking at how do you ensure that you have the right almost protocols in place of making decisions, being open, keeping it representative so it isn't, just the loud voices. But then we're also, we look to the local plan about, what's coming up if we know developments are there. So in Swaffham, we're very much focused on, okay, can we go to those suites? Not everyone has moved in, but you can start to understand, why have you moved here? What's good, what isn't so good, what's unexpected. And then also we try to plan as much flexibility as possible too in our approach. I think we look at, what would be the best case, but also that kind of testing process. You may want to test this. So for example, a lot of the time you say do a parking survey. It's like, you might want to just test it to close this off and see how it works, and then try to do that on a larger scale too. So whilst we are not future tellers, we can start to just look at, what is happening, or, in the Heathway, it's really close to a station and they're going to redevelop that area. I guess it then just becomes really important not to remove things that are working well, but also provide space for the new to come in, things that we can't predict, but just allow, I think that flexibility is really important for us too.
I have a question about funding for all this project. So I understand that some funding might come from different charity or different funding options, but have you ever had experience that the funding is not enough to cover your design, and you have to then adjust the design or simplify or do a bit of a value engineering of the project?
Yeah, no, that's really that's really good to hear because, interesting question, and also something we're working through right now. So, for example, with the Heathway project, we finished, we're there for 8 months, then we had a list of projects, right? Like, we became very clear about what's needed.
You have to actually deliver it.
Exactly, and at that point, we didn't know if we were going to get levelling up funding. So then there was a nervousness from the client about, wow, we can't tell them, all of these projects are what they need, but we can't deliver that. And so, but what was really important to us is that people just need to know this is what you've said, and just be really clear, we do not have funding for this at the moment. We can go ahead with this. We see that this has a really high impact. We can now get funding for this, or we will now be searching. But just to show that consideration, because what we found is there is then this real need, or like this fear of just don't show them, which is the worst thing, because that people know what they've said, they know where it's leading towards. So then, and people always know when you're not quite being open or telling the truth. So we just want to be as clear as possible, and people are really sensible. They're like, we want it to be affordable, we want it to be maintained well, because we don't want it to just look good in day one and not, after day 5. So for us, we're just very open. They know councils don't have that much money, but they know that you could potentially get some money from developer contributions, or you could get some, with Pearly, we managed to get just over £200,000, which isn't necessarily a lot, but for community projects, it has a really big impact of making some real change that they can see happen on the ground quite quickly. So we just try and be as open and honest about what that means.
Angela?
Yeah, hi Stephanie. Lovely presentation and so well laid out with all your beautiful graphics. Yeah, when you're doing community consultation, how do you reach a consensus when you will have various people that will prioritise different things? So if some people want, to have a certain part of the park done for young people or for elders, or a certain thing, and there's only so much money to go around, how do you actually get them? Do you get them to vote and put up their hand, or do you have options, or how do you do it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we've experienced this at different points of the process. And for us, what's been really good is when we have set up these forums, it's a really nice way to have a really open conversation. Someone will say, I really want this to happen. And someone else will say, well, I really want this to happen. And so, for example, Swaffham, we literally had a section to say, to park or not to park, It's addressing, we hear you, we understand what you're saying, but we also see that you also have shared priorities with another group. And I think that helps when we are able to almost analyse and show the priorities across a group. So, and I think what's important for us is to ask the question a few whys, why, and why, and sometimes it's not necessarily that exact thing in that area, but it's more deep set of, no one ever listens to me, I would like this here because I now have an opportunity, or if we know it's going to be contentious, we'll try and look at more, maybe a co-solving group, or a co-creation, rather than a very specific codesign, I want to chair here, so that we can look at, okay, this is the process, this group said this group, we're trying to look at the least harmful, highest impact, but really communicate how we made those decisions, as opposed to we chose you over this person, because it is quite complicated.
Yeah.
It really is.
Definitely. I was, to bring Victoria in, you're both clearly, absolutely, totally dedicated to empowering youth and empowering the voice of youth. There's a question that Victoria, you'd like to ask Stephanie about the way her methodology has evolved over the years. Because you were assessing her work for the award.
Yes.
Yeah.
The thing.
Yeah.
Don't want to tell her all the things. No, I've got to be very open as well. So, I think the thing is it's about actually how you see that process. But it's not a process in itself. And I think the question always, and I think it's with all these kind of programs, is how do you either continue it, or how do you connect it with, if they're asking you to do that work, what happens when that work stops? And how does it get connected back in when perhaps things start again, perhaps with you or without you? But how do you what's the mechanism to try and feed that in so it stays there? Because again, I think about the consultation or connecting with them, they do it, and yes, they understand that. But then something comes and they say, where's all the work we've done?
Yeah.
So how have you challenged that, or looked at, or how do you kind of cope with it? Or how do you think you might cope with it if you haven't?
It's funny you're saying that, because I think I was walking here thinking about that exact question, because we always try and build in a legacy to our projects. I think actually because of Pearly, knowing that it kind of dropped off a cliff, but the good thing about that is we had the Pearly panel. So there was already a mechanism to reach out to a group of people that were connected, that can be refreshed. And that was really useful to us. You know, with Dagenham, we're thinking, we've spoken so much. If we didn't have levelling up funds, we really needed to start thinking about how that could be, how that could continue. So I think it's about almost that handover process for us is really important. So with the Pearly panel, we're doing a lot of work with them now, but we know we now need to step away a bit. So it's almost helping them to set up a framework to move forward. Hopefully it will continue, you know, in a form that works for the community. But also now with what's great about the work with Dagenham is within that process, we now have quite a few, you know, stewards or champions that we know can take it forward quite well, can have those connections more focused with Be First or, you know, London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, whether it's through the shop that continues or just being part of a database or a group that can work together, and they have key people to reach out to that will last a bit longer than me, you know, or us as a group.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it might be the engagement officer. They always have that connecting line, or they know how to make those changes.
So you need to help them to have those connections, those associations, and actually have that buy-in somewhere into that next stage, which is, in that sense, is sort of more of the council. Do you, with that, you talked about the activities book and things. Are you thinking about how you actually help them to take those steps forward or to question it? So they're there. So how do they trigger, or how do they sort of infiltrate back into the council?
Yeah.
Because often that is, you know, this sort of becomes still a bit of a barrier, doesn't it? And you get slightly maybe patted on the head, as it were, not taken so seriously, I suppose.
You mean as a community member?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen that as well. I think especially with Pearly, because there is the Pearly panel, and now they're a force. They can do a lot, and so you can see that whilst the council want to guide them, they're very much more open to us as a team. You know, speaking to them on their behalf. So for us, it's really about, you know, we're looking at this funding of safeguarding enough for them to be paid to continue, or we now are, you know, just showing them how to, I guess, engage with the council formally as well as informally, knowing that they have more knowledge about what to expect, how to be a bit more empowered. But then there's a limitation. We can't do everything. No. I think we definitely see that. We try our best and we try and make sure they have those connections. But then also, we try and also communicate, and the council can see that they can get on and do a lot of work without disturbing the council. They're essentially doing council services for them, which is a big benefit for someone, you know, groups and clients that have less resources.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting part of that process, isn't it? And I suppose the final bit with it is we're talking about the young people, the group, but actually it's more work when you're doing this, which you have enough to do anyway, is to try and kind of engage with the council to bring them in, because often it's that communication, isn't it, that is missing all of this. And if they buy into it, then you've got the champions inside the council as well. You need it two ways, don't you?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, 100%.
So we've got time for one more question.
I was wondering if you are always kind of working with councils as a client, or if you work with developers.
So we've mostly worked with councils at the moment, so a lot of local authorities. Be First are not the local authority, but they are the development arm of the local authority. We have, you know, in previous lives worked with developers and consortiums on projects. But at the moment we are doing mostly work.
And I guess I asked the question because I'm wondering, you know, in London you have the London plan, and then you have areas that will have their local plan. And so you have some of these existing frameworks in place. What would be the strategies you would think of to kind of circumvent the natural process of, you know, the council meets with the developer, they have their pre-application discussions, the community isn't really involved in that, and then afterwards then there's public consultation, but there's design that's already been happening and plans that's already been happening. You know, how do you circumvent the process when you're in that kind of situation?
Yeah, that is a challenge. I think where developers have reached out to us, and lots of the time it's been in that space, and I would love to engage. We're like, but you've designed it. What do you want us to do? And they're like, no. And I was like, but you showed us the document. It's very detailed. So we can't be those people to lie to a community to do that. It just, other people can do that. We can't do that. So I don't know how to circumvent. We know that essentially the clients we've worked with have that sense. They know they need that, and that has worked well for us. We were talking before about how do you convince. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of value. I think you might need to see it be brought along the process. We're having conversations about different developers coming to some of our workshops so that they can see that people aren't always angry all the time. You know, there are these perceptions. And that you can have a conversation. They are sensible because they're rational people who know about, you know, for example, they do know about how to, like, funding works, and they do know there isn't infinite amounts of money. So step by step, I don't have an answer to your question.
It seems the key for the methodology to work, or any kind of meaningful community engagement, is that for that to happen at the beginning.
Yes, 100%.
Right? So it seems like with the way you're working, you're finding councils, clients that actually want to do that from the beginning.
Yeah.
But I guess it's difficult to operate when you don't have necessarily a client that's actually asking for that at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's hopefully making a difference with, like, white papers and policies, you know, because it's definitely moving that direction. There's not enough, I think, mandatories, but hopefully we'll get there. So I feel like it's moving.
Well, I think the local plan is the next route, and the trouble is that's policy when you're a practice, but actually local plan coming up now is the only time, and because of the Social Value Act, and that the councils are actually wanting more of this, they expect it, and because in terms they have to present it as well. They have to show, so it can't be just a tick box from their side as well. But you have to show, in a way, it's trying to show the value to them, and they get a lot out of it as well. But if the councils see it as a tick box, then nothing will happen. So in a way, the local plan is at the moment the sort of route in policy to try and push this through. But there's not that many people pushing it through. It needs a lot more work, and bearing in mind the local plan's 2024. So this, you know, it's a year to actually show that value. And just coming back to, in a way, to the awards, in a way it's trying to recognise and showcase actually what's going on and that it works and that it should be in there. So it's really trying to find mechanisms to actually say this, because that is the time that policy is going to happen. Otherwise, you're hoping that the developers will take this on board, and some will, clever ones will, but it's sort of the next group down is the more hard to convince to come through, and that's where that kind of work. And so, as you say, you know, you're really trying to do the doing, but you also recognise that policy issue as well, and you can't divorce the two, but you need both sides in a way to actually prove it, but know that it works. We all know it works, but we need to actually push that into that policy side a bit more, which is hard work when you're trying to do everything as well.
Yeah, that's
to
true.
actually sort of kind of open that door as well, isn't it?
So true. But then even on that, what we found is the value of doing this. It provides such a great evidence base. Like, you're able to get so much more funding and buy-in because you have the evidence and the backing of the community, and that helps with, you know, levelling up funding. It helps with Pearly. It helps with, you know, Swaffham moving, you know, for some of their additional funding. So showcasing value.
Sorry, Steph, just to jump in quickly, because I worked with Steph on Pearly, but a lot of the strategic framework was written into the local plan as well. So it will be potentially adopted into the local plan 2023. So there is some influence of some of that community vision is actually going into policy, and should hopefully shape, because there was so much development in Pearly, so it should hopefully shape some of that development as well. So
that needs to be shown out to the other councils, etc. So it's good to have that evidence base to actually provide that as an example.
Definitely. And so here we have it. Stephanie is a real trailblazer. This is a field that must, as Victoria said earlier, go mainstream. the authority that the community can offer that is really, really important. I think someone like Stephanie is going to believe she's already creating a legacy, but she will carry on doing that. So I'm hugely impressed with everything that she's achieved so far, and I really, I'm confident that you'll make a huge impact going forward as well. So put your hands together and thank you. Very, very quickly.